Lee Kuan Yew, From Third World to First. The Singapore Story, 1965 to 2000. You probably know Singapore as a gleaming city-state with a striking skyline and strict chewing gum laws. Maybe you've heard about its economic miracle, how it went from poverty to prosperity in one generation. In 1965, many predicted the experiment would fail within years. Singapore had no natural resources, no military, and had just been expelled by Malaysia, while racial riots tore through its streets. But the real story goes deeper than economic statistics or urban planning. This blink takes you inside the decisions that created modern Singapore. From secretly hiring Israeli military advisors disguised as Mexicans, to forcing young men from different races to live together in army barracks. You'll see how Lee Kuan Yew courted the multinational corporations other countries feared, why he scattered flowers on the graves of executed enemies, and why he told educated men they were stupid for their marriage choices. These lessons in pragmatic leadership and strategic thinking show you how nations get built when failure means extinction, and why comfort might be the biggest threat to everything you've created. The shock of creation. The tears streaming down Lee Kuan Yew's face on August 9, 1965, told their own story. Singapore hadn't fought for independence. It had been thrown out of Malaysia like an unwanted child. Lee called his new nation a heart without a body, a tiny island severed from its hinterland with 2 million people, no natural resources, and a small domestic market torn by racial riots. The old trading post economy was dying as bigger neighbors planned to bypass Singapore entirely, making survival the only priority. Two threats loomed immediately: physical insecurity and economic collapse. Security came first, and the situation was desperate. Singapore had no army. Its 2 battalions answered to Malaysian command, with a Malaysian brigadier acting like he could seize the island whenever he pleased. Lee approached India and Egypt for help, but both ignored him, so he turned to Israel, another small country surrounded by hostile neighbors. Israeli military advisors arrived secretly, disguised as Mexicans, to avoid provoking Muslim neighbors in Malaysia and Indonesia. Their biggest contribution was national service, which forced young Chinese, Malay, and Indian men to live together, train together, and depend on each other. Racial barriers started breaking down as a shared identity began forming, sending a clear message that Singapore would defend itself. When French tanks rolled through city streets during a 1969 military parade, any nation thinking about aggression got the memo. The economy demanded equal urgency. The old entrepot model was finished, and Singapore needed a new purpose at a time when development experts preached dependency theory, the idea that multinational corporations, or MNCs, were neo-colonial exploiters, stealing cheap land and labor from poor countries. Lee and his economic advisor, Albert Winsemius, thought this was nonsense. They recognized that Singapore had nothing for MNCs to exploit except hardworking people and a government committed to competence and honesty. Their strategy broke every rule by forgetting about competing with neighbors and connecting directly with America, Europe, and Japan instead. They would attract multinationals for technology, management skills, and global market access. The Economic Development Board became a one-stop shop that slashed red tape for investors, while Lee turned himself into Singapore's chief salesman, personally pitching American CEOs on why this vulnerable island made sense for business. This outward focus defied the protectionist thinking everywhere else. But when you're facing extinction, conventional wisdom becomes a luxury you can't afford. Still, armies and economic plans weren't enough. Global companies needed proof that Singapore could create something unprecedented in Southeast Asia. A society with rock-solid stability and iron discipline. That would become the next chapter of survival. Writing a social contract. Promises of stability mean nothing if you can't deliver. Lee Kuan Yew understood that armies deter invaders and economic plans create jobs, but neither builds a nation. He needed a new social contract, one that would bind immigrant communities to their new home and each other. Lee had studied in Britain, watching the post-war labor government build its welfare state. He saw a noble system that created dependency and killed the drive to succeed. Singapore, with zero resources, couldn't afford that luxury. His vision was different, a fair society where the government helped people help themselves. At the heart of this would be asset creation, personal responsibility, and self-reliance. The Central Provident Fund became his main tool. What started as a basic colonial retirement scheme became the foundation of Singaporean society. Year after year, he raised the compulsory savings rate. Workers watched bigger chunks of their paychecks disappear before they touched them. Painful? Absolutely. But it created one of the world's highest savings rates, kept inflation in check, and gave the government massive domestic capital. Singapore could build infrastructure without begging for foreign loans. The second purpose was genius. Lee believed political stability required citizens to own a piece of the country, literally. In 1968, he let people use their CPF savings for down payments and mortgages on public housing. This single move changed everything. Now every worker, even the humblest, had a path to ownership. A family that owns its home defends it, and defends the country that made ownership possible. During the mid-1960s riots, Lee watched young men carrying their scooters up apartment stairs to protect them. That sense of property hadn't existed in the 1950s riots. The CPF became more than a pension fund. It built a nation of stakeholders. But here's the thing. Citizens only accept such demanding savings rates if they trust their money won't disappear. Lee watched other newly independent nations where freedom fighters turned into plunderers. But Singapore would be different. His ministers wore simple white shirts to signal purity and honesty. Symbolism alone wasn't enough, though. He gave the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau teeth, the power to investigate any minister or official, reporting directly to him. Then came the so-called Killer Amendment. If officials lived beyond their means or owned unexplained property, that alone could prove bribery in court. The burden of proof shifted. Hiding corrupt gains became nearly impossible. Nobody was untouchable. In 1986, Tay Chung-wan, the long-serving Minister for National Development, got caught taking $800,000 in bribes. Rather than face public disgrace, he killed himself. A personal tragedy that sent an iron message. The system was absolute. This zero-tolerance approach gave the government moral authority. They could demand sacrifice because people trusted them. With internal discipline locked down, Singapore could finally face the world as something more than a desperate experiment. The foundation was set. Now came the real test. A small fish in a big pond. A well-run house means nothing if the neighborhood is burning. Singapore had built internal discipline and economic momentum, but survival demanded something more. Strategic space to breathe in a world of superpower rivalries and regional chaos. Lee Kuan Yew's foreign policy mirrored his domestic approach, unsentimental, clear-eyed, and focused on creating room for Singapore to thrive. The immediate challenge? Managing the giants next door. Malaysia was the eternal headache. Lee called it a relationship between Big Brother, or Abang, and Little Brother, Adik, never equals and always friction. The core problem ran deep. Malaysia was building a Malay First Nation, but Singapore insisted on multiracial meritocracy. These opposing visions created permanent tension. Malaysian leaders wielded water like a weapon. Singapore's supply came from Johor, and during disputes, the threat of turning off the taps hung in the air. Malaysia built up its own ports and financial systems, trying to bypass Singapore economically. Open conflict was unthinkable, genuine friendship impossible. This relationship required daily management. Indonesia told a different story, one of dramatic reversal. From 1963 to 1966, President Sukarno had launched Konfrontasi, an undeclared war to crush the Malaysian Federation, which included Singapore. Indonesian commandos infiltrated the island, bombs exploded in buildings, and the threat of invasion hung constant in the air. Everything changed in 1965 when General Suharto took over. Pragmatic, anti-communist, Focused on Indonesia's broken economy, he ended Konfrontasi. Trust came slowly. In 1968, Singapore executed 2 Indonesian Marines for a bombing during Konfrontasi. Indonesia erupted. The Singapore embassy was sacked, relations frozen. 5 years passed before the breakthrough. Lee's first official Jakarta visit in 1973 included a calculated gesture. At Kalibata Heroes Cemetery, he paid respects to generals killed in the 1965 coup. Then he did something unexpected. He walked to the graves of those 2 executed Marines and scattered flowers. This single act, deeply meaningful in Javanese culture, healed a national wound. It showed respect that Sukarno never had. That moment unlocked a partnership between Lee and Suharto that would last 25 years. But regional management only worked under a larger security umbrella, and that meant America. Lee initially distrusted the Americans. Naive, heavy-handed. A clumsy 1961 CIA attempt to bribe a Singaporean intelligence officer hadn't helped. Yet pragmatism won. Only the United States could serve as Southeast Asia's anti-communist anchorman. Vietnam mattered. Lee believed American intervention there, though it failed locally, bought the region precious time. That decade allowed ASEAN's non-communist countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, to stabilize and grow. Without that American shield, Lee was convinced communism would have swept the entire peninsula. The partnership crystallized in 1990, just before Lee stepped down. Singapore signed a memorandum granting U.S. forces access to its military facilities. When America lost its Philippine bases, Singapore became the regional anchor. The ultimate insurance policy was in place. Foreign policy had become another survival tool, carefully wielded to create breathing room for a tiny nation with massive ambitions. Learning from the giants. Foreign policy goes beyond managing threats and alliances. For Lee Kuan Yew, survival meant studying others obsessively, learning from their successes, avoiding their failures. The West provided technology and markets, but Asia's 2 giants, Japan and China, would shape the region's future. Japan was personal. The brutal occupation during World War II had scarred Lee's generation. Yet he couldn't ignore the country's post-war resurrection. What he saw there became a blueprint for Singapore. The Japanese treated every job like art. During one visit, Lee watched a provincial hotel chef peel fruit with the precision of a master craftsman. Years of practice distilled into perfect movements. Factory workers and executives wore the same uniforms and walked the same floors. British managers, by comparison, sat in carpeted offices and had chauffeurs wipe grease off their shoes. These cultural aspects of work produced near-zero defect manufacturing and fierce national purpose. So Lee brought these lessons straight to Singapore. Quality control circles, new relationships between management and unions. Japan showed what discipline could build. China, on the other hand, was different. Singapore's ethnic Chinese majority made neighbors nervous. Would it become Beijing's Trojan horse? These fears had teeth. China supported communist insurgencies across Southeast Asia. Radio broadcasts from Beijing called Singapore's leaders running dogs of U.S. and British imperialism. Everything changed in November 1978 when Deng Xiaoping came to Singapore. Recently restored to power, Deng wanted Southeast Asia united with China against the Soviet Union and Vietnam. Lee had other ideas. In their long meeting, he spoke plainly. Russia wasn't the problem. China was. Those radio broadcasts, those appeals to overseas Chinese patriotism, they were destabilizing the region, undermining local governments. China couldn't rally support against Vietnam when it was still backing the Malayan Communist Party's attempts to overthrow Malaysia and Singapore. Lee watched Deng's face change. He expected ideological bluster, the kind Mao's successor had delivered 2 years earlier. Instead, Deng listened. His body language showed real concern. Then came the question no communist leader had ever asked, "What do you want me to do?" Think about that moment. The leader of tiny Singapore advising China's paramount leader to stop the broadcasts, cease the kinship appeals. Deng absorbed it all and promised to consider it. 2 years later, the broadcast stopped. That meeting convinced Li he was dealing with a pragmatist who would abandon decades of dogma when faced with truth. Deng saw something too, a clean, disciplined, prosperous society built by descendants of southern Chinese peasants. 14 years later, during his famous Southern Tour that launched China's economic boom, Deng held up Singapore as the model. He told his people to learn from Singapore's experience and do better. The relationship had traveled from ideological hostility to pragmatic partnership. Remember how Singapore started? Expelled, vulnerable, learning to survive. Now it was teaching giants. The student had something worth studying. The unfinished work of nation building. The student had become the teacher. But Lee Kuan Yew knew that nations built on willpower alone rarely outlive their founders. Singapore's prosperity brought a new kind of danger, comfort that could breed complacency. Human talent became his obsession. Singapore had nothing else. In 1983, Lee studied census data and saw trouble. Graduate women weren't having children. Less educated women were having many. On national television, he delivered his verdict with typical bluntness. This trend would drain Singapore's future talent pool. He called it stupid for educated men to marry less educated women. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Women across all education levels were furious. His party lost votes in the next election. Lee didn't care. He saw an uncomfortable truth others wanted to ignore. The government-backed dating agency for graduates that followed was widely mocked, but it showed his conviction: countries that waste talent die. Talent alone wouldn't save Singapore, though. You needed shared identity. Lee's bilingual policy was pure pragmatism. English became the working language, neutral between races, connecting Singapore to global business. But English alone could create rootless citizens, disconnected from their heritage. So every student had to master their mother tongue too, Mandarin, Malay, or Tamil. This created a global outlook paired with Asian roots. This meant hard choices. Nanyang University, proud bastion of Chinese education, had to merge with the English-speaking National University. Its graduates couldn't find jobs in an English-dominated economy. The Chinese community felt betrayed. Lee pushed ahead anyway. Then came the question every founder faces: what happens when you're gone? By the 1970s, Lee was headhunting successors like a CEO building a management team. The civil service, military, private sector. He searched everywhere. Political processes alone weren't producing the leaders Singapore needed. Old comrades got dropped from cabinet to make room for younger talent. Painful, yes, but necessary. After the 1988 election, he asked the younger ministers to choose their own leader. They picked Goh Chok Tong. Lee's son, Lee Hsien Loong, would have to earn his position later, on merit. No dynasties here. Then November 1990 came. After 31 years, Lee Kuan Yew stepped down as prime minister. He stayed in the cabinet as senior minister, offering counsel and ensuring stability. The handover was smooth, deliberate, even corporate. He'd built a nation from nothing. Against every prediction, Singapore had traveled from third world to first in a single generation. But Lee understood something his critics often missed. Survival is never guaranteed. Each generation faces the same test. Can they maintain the discipline, pragmatism, and cohesion that created this unlikely success? The founding story was complete. The next chapters would be written by others. Lee had given them the tools: meritocracy over sentiment, pragmatism over ideology, cohesion over division. Whether they'd use them wisely, that remained an open question. In this blink to From Third World to First by Lee Kuan Yew, you've learned that Singapore's transformation from a vulnerable island into a global powerhouse was not an accident, but the result of a deliberate and unsentimental strategy of pragmatic nation building. This journey began with an absolute focus on survival. You saw how a credible army was built from scratch and how a new economic model was created by leapfrogging the region to connect with the developed world. This was built on a unique social contract that rejected the Western welfare model in favor of a stakeholder society, where citizens own their homes through a compulsory savings scheme. For these tough policies to work, the government had to be incorruptible, a principle enforced without exception. This internal stability allowed Singapore to navigate a dangerous world, balancing its relationships with its larger neighbors while aligning with the United States for security. Ultimately, success was secured for the future through a systematic plan for leadership succession, ensuring the nation's progress would outlast its founders. Okay, that's it for this Blink. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to leave us a rating. We always appreciate your feedback. See you in the next Blink.